During one of my trips to Magic Kingdom, my friends and I decided to ride Pirates of the Caribbean late at night, just before the park was about to close. There's something extra special about riding those dark, atmospheric rides after sunset. The park feels different, quieter, almost eerie. We boarded our boat, laughing and chatting, expecting a typical fun ride. But halfway through, right when the ride takes you into one of the darker, more secluded sections, the boat stopped unexpectedly. At first, we thought it was just part of the ride, a small delay. These things happen all the time. But as we sat there in the pitch-black room, something felt off. The silence stretched out uncomfortably, and the usual ride sounds, pirate laughter, music, cannon blasts, faded away. That's when I started to hear it, soft whispering, faint but unmistakable. At first, I thought it was my friends messing with me, but when I turned to ask them if they heard it too, they all shook their heads. No one was whispering. I shrugged it off, but the whispers didn't stop. They grew softer, but somehow closer, like they were coming from just behind me. Every hair on the back of my neck stood up. Finally, the boat jerked forward and we continued the ride like nothing had happened. Everyone was relieved to be moving again, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. When we disembarked, as we were stepping out of the boat, I felt a cold hand brush my arm. It was so quick, so sudden, that I almost thought I imagined it. But it was real. I froze and looked around, but there was no one near me who could have touched me. My friends were already a few steps ahead, oblivious. The cast member operating the ride must have noticed my reaction, because they walked over and asked if I was okay. I didn't know how to explain what I had just felt, so I just nodded. Then, almost casually, the cast member leaned in a bit closer and said, "You're not the first to feel him. They say one of the original ride designers passed away during construction and sometimes lingers in this part of the ride." I got chills. I had always heard rumors about haunted Disney rides, but I never thought I'd experience something firsthand. Even now, every time I ride Pirates of the Caribbean, I can't help but think about that night and wonder if he's still there, waiting in the dark. During a family vacation, we decided to stay at Disney's Contemporary Resort, one of the most iconic hotels on Disney property. The first night was everything you'd expect from a Disney vacation, magical and filled with excitement from spending the day at the parks. We were all exhausted and fell asleep almost instantly after a long day of rides and fireworks. But the second night, something strange happened. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of faint knocking coming from the bathroom. It wasn't loud, more like a light tap, 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 but it was enough to jolt me awake. At first, I thought maybe someone in the room had gotten up to use the bathroom, but when I checked, everyone was still fast asleep. I brushed it off thinking it was probably something harmless like the plumbing or even a noise from the neighboring room. The next night, the same thing happened. Again, around 2 a.m., I heard the knocking. This time, it felt more deliberate, like someone was tapping from the inside of the bathroom. I got up to check, but the room was exactly how it had been when I went to bed, dark and still. I opened the bathroom door, half expecting to find something, but it was empty. Still, the sound continued. By the third night, I was on edge. The knocking had happened every night at the same time, and it was becoming harder to ignore. I didn't mention it to anyone in the family because I didn't want to freak them out, but I was starting to feel uneasy. That night, it wasn't just knocking. As we all lay in bed, trying to fall asleep after another long day, we heard a faint voice. So soft, you could almost convince yourself you imagined it. But we all heard it. It whispered a single word: leave. At that point, I was fully spooked. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was it just exhaustion playing tricks on us? Maybe a neighbor or someone in the hallway? But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The voice felt like it came from right inside our room, On the last night of our stay, I barely slept. I stayed up, waiting for the knocking or any other sounds, but everything was quiet. We packed up the next morning, eager to leave, but as we checked out, I mentioned the strange experiences to a staff member. Their response made my skin crawl. They casually mentioned that a few guests had reported similar experiences in the past, unexplained noises, whispers in the middle of the night. The staff member lowered their voice and added that some believed it was the ghost of a guest who had died in the hotel years ago, though no one really knew for sure. We left that day, and I couldn't shake the eerie feeling the entire way home. I've been back to Disney World since, but I've never stayed at the Contemporary Resort again. Something about that room just didn't feel right, and I'm not eager to relive those nights anytime soon. During a trip to Disney World with some friends, we decided to do a little off-the-map exploring. We'd been hearing whispers throughout the park that there was an old, abandoned attraction hidden somewhere on the property, something that had been closed for decades and long forgotten. It sounded like an urban legend, the kind of spooky tale you'd pass around while waiting in line. But we were curious, and maybe a little too adventurous for our own good. After some searching, we found what seemed like a neglected path near the back of the park, obscured by overgrown bushes and trees. It looked like no one had been back there in years, and there were no signs or warnings telling us to stay away. Our curiosity pushed us forward, so we followed the path, feeling like we were stepping into some secret off-limits area of the park. After walking for a while, we came across it. An old, decaying structure hidden behind a thick wall of trees. It looked like the remnants of a ride, with faded signs and weathered buildings that screamed 1970s Disney. The kind of thing you'd expect from a retro postcard, except everything here was coated in dust and neglect. The paint was peeling, vines were crawling up the walls, and the air felt heavier, colder, even though the Florida sun was still beating down. We stood there for a moment, debating whether we should turn back. But then, as friends often do, we egged each other on, laughing nervously, insisting it was probably just an old kid's ride. What's the harm in looking around? So we slipped through the broken gate and started exploring. The inside of the attraction was eerie. It looked like a small animatronic ride, with those old-school mechanical figures lined up as if waiting to perform their routines. They were dusty and broken, but oddly enough, they looked too lifelike. There was something unsettling about their blank expressions, like they were frozen mid-motion, waiting for the cue to start up again. We wandered deeper into the ride, our footsteps echoing against the silence. Then we heard it, a faint mechanical whirring, like something was powering up. We all froze. There was no way the ride still had power. The whole place was practically falling apart. But the noise persisted, soft but distinct, like gears turning or motors humming in the distance. And then, as we were standing there, one of the animatronics, a figure that looked like an old carnival barker, moved. At first, it was just a twitch, a subtle shift in its posture. But then its head turned, slowly, deliberately, until it was facing us. Its glassy eyes locked onto ours, and I swear I saw its mouth begin to open, as if it was about to speak. That was all we needed to see. We didn't stick around to find out what was going to happen next. Panic surged through all of us, and we bolted for the exit, racing down the overgrown path until we were back in the main part of the park. None of us said a word as we caught our breath, too freaked out to process what had just happened. To this day, I have no idea what we stumbled upon. We never went back to look for that path again, and when we tried to ask a park employee about the old ride, they just shrugged and said there were no abandoned attractions on Disney property. Maybe it was a forgotten piece of history, or maybe it was something else, something Disney doesn't want people to find. But whatever it was, I'll never forget the feeling of those glassy eyes following us out of the dark. It was supposed to be a perfect family day at Disney World. My nephew and I had been looking forward to riding It's a Small World all morning, and we were finally standing in line, inching closer to the entrance. The park was packed with families and tourists, and we were both buzzing with excitement. My nephew, who was only 6, was holding my hand tightly, and we were talking about which parts of the ride he was most excited to see. The usual happy chatter, laughter, and the sound of kids squealing in delight around us. But then, in the blink of an eye, everything changed. One moment, I felt his little hand in mine, and the next, it was gone. I looked down, expecting to see him still standing beside me, but he wasn't there. A wave of confusion hit me at first, thinking he might have just let go of my hand to shift his weight or adjust his shoe. I called his name, glancing around, but there was no response. I scanned the crowd of people all around me, their faces blurred in my growing panic. He wasn't anywhere in sight. My heart dropped. Every parent's worst nightmare was unfolding before my eyes. My nephew had disappeared in the middle of one of the busiest places on earth. I shouted his name again, louder this time, but the noise of the park swallowed my voice. My mind raced. Had he wandered off? Was he just a few feet away, hidden by the sea of people? I started pushing through the crowd, frantically checking every corner, scanning for his small figure. Panic rose like bile in my throat. Minutes felt like hours as I searched, each passing second an eternity. I alerted a nearby park employee, my voice trembling as I explained what had happened. They immediately called security, who jumped into action, sending out descriptions of my nephew across the park. It was agony, knowing he was out there somewhere, but not knowing where or if he was safe. Every horrible scenario flashed through my mind. The minutes dragged on, and the pit in my stomach grew deeper with every passing second. I couldn't breathe properly. I felt like I was in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. After what felt like an eternity, though it was probably around 20 minutes, I finally got a call from one of the park employees. They had found him near the entrance of the park. Relief hit me so hard I nearly collapsed. I rushed over to where they said he was, heart pounding in my chest. When I got there, my nephew was standing with a park employee, looking completely unfazed. He wasn't crying or upset, just confused. I hugged him tightly, my legs shaking with the relief of having him back. I asked him what had happened, where he had gone. What he said sent chills down my spine. He told me that while we were in line, a friendly man in a costume had come up to him. The man told him he had something cool to show him and that my nephew should follow him. Trusting and innocent as any child would be, my nephew said he followed the man, who led him away from the line and towards the entrance of the park. But when he got there, the man disappeared into the crowd. The thing that bothered me most was that the employee said no one matching the description my nephew gave had been seen in the area. They had reviewed some of the footage from the security cameras, but there was no sign of any man leading him. It was as if my nephew had wandered there on his own, but he was adamant that someone friendly and dressed in a costume, had told him to come with them. We never found out who the man was. Disney security kept searching, but no one fitting that description turned up. They assured us that they'd keep an eye out, but nothing ever came of it. It was like the man had simply vanished into thin air. Even now, when I think about it, I get chills. Who was that man? What were his intentions? And why did he target my nephew in such a crowded place? We'll never know. But ever since that day, I've been extra cautious whenever we visit theme parks, and I've never been able to shake the unsettling feeling that someone was watching us, just waiting for the right moment. During one of my last trips to Disney World, I decided to ride Space Mountain late at night. There's something extra thrilling about doing those classic rides after dark. The park quieter, the lines shorter, and the atmosphere a little more eerie. I was excited as usual, and the adrenaline rush of racing through the dark was exactly what I needed. The ride was going as expected, but halfway through, something felt off. I noticed a shadowy figure sitting in the seat ahead of me. At first, I didn't think much of it. It's easy to imagine things in the near-total darkness of Space Mountain. But the longer the ride went on, the more I fixated on the figure. The seat ahead was supposed to be empty. I distinctly remembered the ride operator only loading 2 people behind me and no one in front. Still, I tried to brush it off, focusing instead on the sharp turns and sudden drops. But every time the ride hit a corner, I caught another glimpse of that shadow, its outline somehow darker than the surrounding blackness of the ride. I could swear it was moving, too, like it shifted just slightly with every twist and turn. Finally, the ride came to an end, the familiar hum of machinery slowing as the lights flickered back on. And just as I suspected, the seat in front of me was empty. I had seen someone there, I was sure of it, but there was no one. I got out of the ride vehicle feeling a little shaken, wondering if I had just imagined it all. As I exited, I decided to casually mention it to the ride operator, as if seeking some sort of logical explanation. I expected them to laugh it off, maybe tell me that my eyes had played tricks on me. Instead, the operator looked at me with a knowing expression. Without skipping a beat, they said, "It happens sometimes." I stood there, momentarily stunned, trying to process what they meant. "What happens?" I asked, unsure if I wanted the answer. The operator leaned in slightly, lowering their voice. "People see things. Shadows. Someone sitting there when there shouldn't be. It's usually on one of the last rides of the night." I swallowed hard, suddenly feeling like I was part of something far more unsettling than a simple roller coaster ride. Later, when I met up with a friend at the park, I told them about the strange experience. They got quiet for a moment before telling me a rumor that had been floating around for years. Apparently, back in the 80s, a guest had died on Space Mountain, and since then, riders have reported seeing shadowy figures on the ride, especially when it's close to park closing. To this day, I can't shake the memory of that shadow. Every time someone mentions Space Mountain, I think of that empty seat and the cold, knowing look from the ride operator. Now, whenever I visit Disney World, I'm not so sure I'll be riding Space Mountain after dark again.